The Great Hall of the Valoran Embassy was the kind of place that made a person feel small on purpose. The ceiling was high and curved, built from a dark stone that caught the light and held it in thin silver lines. The floor was smooth and cool, the color of deep water. Long banners hung from the walls, each one carrying the seal of a different Valoran house, stitched in thread so fine it looked like smoke. Everything about the room said that important things happened here, and that the people standing inside it were expected to be important too. Commander Ethan Cole did not feel particularly important. He felt tired, slightly underdressed, and very aware that 40 sets of alien eyes were watching him from the moment he walked through the door. He had arrived on the Valoran homeworld 2 days ago, after a 17-hour transit from the edge of human space. He had been briefed, washed, given a formal uniform that fit almost correctly, and told that the choosing ceremony would begin at the third bell. He had asked what the third bell sounded like. Nobody had given him a useful answer, so he had simply shown up when everyone else did, and hoped that was close enough. The choosing ceremony was simple in structure, if not in feeling. The Valoran Council had arranged 6 of their members in a curved line at the far end of the hall. Ethan was expected to walk the line, greet each member, and then select one of them to serve as his official diplomatic partner for the duration of the alliance negotiations. The partner would stand beside him at every formal event, translate when words failed, guide him through customs he did not know, and speak on his behalf when the council required a Valoran voice. It was an honor, the ambassador had told him. Choosing carefully showed wisdom. Choosing poorly showed exactly the opposite. Ambassador Carol Trent had been stationed on the Valoran homeworld for 11 years. She was a small, precise woman with gray at her temples and eyes that had the look of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. She stood at Ethan's left shoulder as he entered the hall and spoke to him in a low, steady voice. "The 5 on the left are veterans," she said. "General Doru Vel has led 3 campaigns. Minister Hara commands the eastern trade routes. The other 3 have similar records, all decorated, all experienced, all expecting to be chosen." Ethan walked slowly, the way he always did when he was paying attention. "And the 6th? There was a short pause. "Princess Sarah Vel, youngest daughter of the ruler. She works in the lower archive, studies old contact histories mostly. She has never been selected as a partner before." "Why not?" Carol considered the question for a moment. "She is not considered a practical choice." Ethan glanced down the line. The 5 veterans were easy to identify. They stood with their crests raised, their scales bright, their posture carrying the kind of easy confidence that came from being recognized their entire lives. They were impressive in an obvious way, the kind of impressive that filled a room without trying. The 6th stood at the far end. Princess Sarah Vel was smaller than the others, and her scales were a pale silver rather than the deep golds and blues of the veterans beside her. Her crest, the feathered ridge that ran along the back of a Valoran skull, was lower than theirs, and she held a datapad against her chest with both hands, lightly, the way a person holds something they keep close out of habit. She was not performing. She was not trying to fill the room. She was simply standing there, watching him approach with pale gold eyes that were careful and quiet, and paying very close attention. Ethan greeted the first council member. He used the correct bow, the correct words, and the correct pause before speaking. The general received him with a broad, satisfied expression. Ethan moved to the second. The minister nodded graciously. The 3rd and 4th were warm and polished, and exactly what they appeared to be. The 5th smiled and said in perfect human standard that he hoped the commander would find the alliance productive. Then Ethan reached the end of the line. He stopped in front of Sarah Vel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, her pale gold eyes were steadier than he had expected. She was not nervous exactly. She was watchful. There was a difference. "Council Member Sarah Vel," he said, "I am choosing you as my partner." The hall went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has happened, and everyone is deciding how to respond. Sarah blinked once. Then she blinked again. Her crest, which had been low and still, lifted several inches in a single sharp movement. Her grip on the datapad tightened. She stared at him with an expression that sat somewhere between complete surprise and careful disbelief. The look of someone who has heard something they very much want to be true and is not yet sure whether to believe it. "Me?" she said. Her voice was soft, a little lower than he had expected. "You are choosing me as your partner, human?" "Yes," Ethan said. The silence in the hall lasted another second. Then the 5 veterans shifted, and the low sound of Velaran murmuring began to move through the room like water finding cracks in stone. General Doru Vel stepped forward from the line. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who was used to having space made for him. His scales were a deep, rich blue, and his crest was fully raised, which on a Velaran of his age and rank meant he was making a point. "Commander Cole," he said. His human standard was precise and unhurried. Perhaps the transit was long, and the briefing files were not fully reviewed. Council member Sarah has no formal diplomatic record. She has not attended a senior session. She has not served in a partner role before. "I read the files," Ethan said. Doru looked at him for a moment. "Then you understand that this choice is unusual." "Yes," Ethan said, "I do." Doru held his gaze for another beat, then stepped back into line. He did not argue further, but the look on his face said clearly that he believed the human had made a mistake, and that the mistake would show itself before long. Carol appeared at Ethan's shoulder again. Her voice was barely above a murmur. "Commander, are you certain? This is not a small decision. The partner walks beside you for the entire negotiation period." "I know," Ethan said. "She has never done this before." "I know that too." Carol studied the side of his face for a moment, the way she studied most things, quickly and completely. Then she gave a single small nod and stepped back. Sarah had not moved. She was still standing at the end of the line, still holding her datapad, still watching him with those careful pale gold eyes. Her crest had not lowered again. She looked like someone standing at a door that had just opened for the first time, and was not yet sure whether to walk through. Ethan turned back to her and held her gaze. "Shall we begin?" he said simply. Sarah looked at him for one more long moment. Then, slowly and deliberately, she stepped out of the line and came to stand beside him. Her crest stayed high. The murmuring in the hall continued. The corridor outside the great hall was long and cool and lined on both sides with thin windows that looked out onto a courtyard full of gray stone and low silver plants. The light that came through the windows was the pale blue-green of early Valoran afternoon, and it made everything inside the corridor look like it was underwater. Sarah walked beside Ethan and did not speak. He did not push her. He had learned a long time ago that silence after a big moment was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was a person sorting through what had just happened, laying it out carefully, deciding what to do with it. He had learned to respect that kind of quiet. They walked the full length of the corridor before she said anything. "The other council members will talk," she said. Her voice was even, like she was reporting a fact rather than complaining about one. "They already are," Ethan said. "It does not bother you?" "Not particularly." She glanced at him with a short sideways look, the kind a person gives when they are checking something. "General Doru has never been passed over before, not for anything. I noticed." "He is not a bad person," she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, like she was being fair on purpose. "He is simply someone who has always been the obvious answer. It is hard to understand being passed over when you have never experienced it." Ethan looked at her. "And you have experienced it." She did not answer right away. She looked straight ahead at the end of the corridor, where a set of wide doors opened onto the guest wing. "I have been on that selection line 4 times," she said finally. This is the first time anyone has stopped at my end of it. He did not say he was sorry. He did not think she wanted that. What did you do during the other ceremonies? He asked instead. I stood in the line and waited, she said. And then I went back to the archive. Every time? Every time. They reached the doors of the guest wing and stopped. A Valoran attendant appeared from a side passage, bowed to them both, and gestured toward the inner rooms. Ethan thanked him, and the attendant looked briefly startled, the way people sometimes did when someone thanked them for a small thing. Sarah noticed. Her eyes moved from the attendant to Ethan and back. You thanked him, she said, once the attendant had gone. He showed us the way. He is staff. Council partners do not usually thank staff. Ethan shrugged one shoulder. It does not cost anything. She was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet this time. Less careful, more thoughtful, like she was filing something away. They were given separate rooms that shared a small sitting area between them, furnished with low chairs and a long table, and a window that looked out over the same courtyard as the corridor. The silver plants outside moved very slightly in a wind that could not be felt from inside. Ethan poured 2 cups of water from the pitcher on the table and set one in front of the chair across from him. He sat down. After a moment, Sarah sat in the other chair. She placed her data pad on the table but kept one hand resting near it, the same way she had held it in the ceremony hall. He had noticed she always kept it close. What do you study? He asked. Specifically. She looked at the data pad, then at him. The early contact era, the first 100 years after humans and Valorans began meeting each other. Most people consider it a quiet period. No large wars, no defining treaties, just many small interactions between people who did not fully understand each other yet. But you find it interesting. I find it the most interesting period of all, she said, and something shifted in her voice when she said it, a small warmth that had not been there before. Because everything that came after was built on what happened then. The words that moved from one language to the other, the gestures that changed meaning over time, the small mistakes that became customs. None of it felt important when it was happening. All of it mattered enormously. Ethan rested his arms on the table. What is the most interesting thing you have found? She looked at him with that careful, checking expression again. She was deciding, he thought, whether he was asking to be polite or asking because he wanted to know. He waited. She made her decision. There was a human traitor in the early contact years, she said. His name does not appear in any official records, but he appears in 17 different Valoran personal diaries from the same period. Not because he was powerful, not because he negotiated anything significant. She paused. Because he always remembered names. Every Valoran he met, he wrote the name down and used it correctly the next time. Every time. In a period when most humans could not distinguish one Valoran from another, he knew every name. And the Valorans wrote about him for that. 17 of them, she said. One wrote that he was the first human who made her feel like a person rather than an obstacle. She looked at the table. That traitor's small habit changed the way an entire trade post treated humans for the next 30 years. It is in none of the official histories. It is only in the diaries. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That is why you study the small things. Because the small things are what actually happened, she said. The big agreements are just the record of what the small things already built. Outside, the silver plants moved again in the unseen wind. Ethan leaned back in his chair. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to know I am asking because I want an honest answer, not a polite one. She straightened slightly. All right. In the ceremony, you asked me why I chose you. I gave you a short answer. I want to give you the full one now, if that is acceptable. She nodded once. I chose you because of how you were standing, he said. The 5 veterans were ready. They had their posture, and their crests, and their records, and they knew what they looked like. They have known what they look like their whole lives. He paused. But you were standing at the end of that line, holding your datapad, like it was the only real thing in the room. You were not performing anything. You were just there, paying attention, and I could see from 20 feet away that your mind was working, even while you were waiting. Sarah looked at him steadily. I have worked with very impressive people, he said. The most impressive ones, the ones who actually solved hard problems, were almost never the ones who looked impressive in a room. They were the ones who noticed what other people missed, and the people who notice things are almost always the ones who have spent time in the quiet, watching, because nobody was watching them. The room was still. Sarah's crest rose slowly. It was a small movement, and then a larger one, until it was fully raised and steady. That is a very unusual reason, she said at last. It is an honest one, he said. She looked at her datapad, then back at him. When she looked at him this time, there was something open in her expression that had not been there before. Not quite trust yet. Something earlier than trust, the thing that comes just before it, when a person stops bracing for a disappointment that does not arrive. I will be a good partner, she said. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement of intention, quiet and certain. I know, Ethan said. Outside the window, the blue-green light was beginning to deepen toward evening, and the silver plants caught it and held it, glowing very softly in the growing dark. The trade negotiation with the Murath Combine was scheduled for the second morning, in a long room on the eastern side of the embassy that smelled faintly of something metallic and sweet at the same time. Ethan had read the briefing on the Murath the night before. They were a species known across 4 star systems for 2 things. The first was their textile production, which was so fine that a single Murath cloth panel could hold more detail than a printed photograph. The second was their negotiating style, which was famously circular, layered, and deeply indirect. A Murath diplomat did not say what they wanted. They said everything else first, in long, careful spirals, that eventually, if a listener was patient enough, pointed toward the actual point. Missing the actual point was easy. It was what they counted on. Ethan arrived early. Sarah was already there. She was sitting at the far end of the Valoran side of the table, not at the main seat, which was reserved for him, but beside it, close enough to be useful. She had 2 datapads in front of her instead of 1. The second was smaller and older, with a worn edge on one corner. She was reading from it with the focused stillness of someone who had been awake for a while. You came early, he said. I have been here since the 5th bell, she said, without looking up. The Murath delegation that is coming today was involved in the Kessler talks 90 years ago. Not the same individuals, obviously, but the same house, same training, same methods. She turned a page. I wanted to review the records. Ethan sat down. What did you find? She looked up then. They always open with an indirect approach. They will speak for a long time about history and shared experience and old agreements. It sounds generous. It is not generous. It is a frame. They are building a feeling of debt before they name their actual request. She tapped the older datapad. In the Kessler talks, they use the same structure 4 times across 6 sessions. Every time, the other party started responding to the frame instead of waiting for the real point. It cost them significantly. And when someone waited them out, it happened once. A Valoran minister named Sovi held silence through an entire opening address, and then responded only to the specific number the Murath had buried in the middle of the 4th statement. She allowed herself a small expression, not quite a smile, but close. The Murath negotiator reportedly paused for 11 seconds before responding. 11 seconds is a very long time for a Murath. It means they were not expecting it. Ethan looked at her. You spent the night reading about a 90-year-old negotiation? I spent the night reading about 4 of them, she corrected. He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She looked at him directly. "You say that a great deal. You did something useful. It deserves acknowledgement." She considered this. Most people treat preparation as an expectation. They do not thank you for meeting an expectation. "I think preparation this thorough is more than meeting an expectation," he said. She did not respond to that, but her crest rose a fraction, just enough to be visible, and she turned back to her datapad. The Marath delegation arrived 12 minutes later. There were 8 of them, all in identical gray robes that moved like heavy water when they walked. Their faces were smooth and angular, with wide-set eyes that blinked slowly and independently of each other. Their lead negotiator was a tall figure who moved to the head of the opposite side of the table with the unhurried ease of someone who had never once felt out of place in a room. The lead Marath opened with a greeting that lasted 3 minutes. It was warm and elaborate, and referenced the long history between the Valoran people and the Combine, using specific dates and events that sounded complimentary, but were arranged in a way that quietly emphasized Valoran dependence on Marath trade routes during a difficult century. He kept his face still and his posture easy, and gave no sign that he was counting anything. Under the table, Sarah slid the smaller datapad toward him, without looking at him. He glanced down. She had typed a note in careful, small letters. The debt framing started in the second paragraph. Third belt mineral rights are the actual goal. Ignore everything until they name a number. They will name it indirectly, wrapped in a reference to long-term infrastructure. It will be too high by about 12%. First counter should be 9% below their real floor, with a transit provision attached. They will push back twice, and then accept. Ethan read it once, then he typed back one word. "Certain?" Her reply came in under 10 seconds. The same lead house used this structure in 2287, 2301, and 2318. 3 for 3 on the 4th round acceptance. "Yes, certain." The Marath lead spoke for another 32 minutes. He was genuinely skilled. His language was beautiful in a technical way, like watching someone solve a complicated puzzle very smoothly. He referenced ancient agreements and mutual respect and the importance of long-term partnership with the kind of practiced ease that came from doing something so many times it no longer required thought. When he finally stopped and turned his slow blinking eyes to Ethan with an expression of polished expectation, the room went quiet. Ethan leaned forward slightly. He did not address the history. He did not address the framing, or the debt references, or the elaborate groundwork that had just been laid across 30 minutes of careful speech. He went straight to the third belt, named a number that was 9% below where Sarah's notes said the real floor sat, and attached a transit provision that gave the Marath something they wanted, without costing the Valorans anything that mattered. The lead Marath's expression did not change. His slow, blinking eyes moved fractionally, just for a moment, and he turned to the member on his left and spoke in a low cluster of sounds. General Doru, who was observing from a seat along the wall, leaned forward very slightly. The Marath pushed back. Ethan listened, nodded, and held the number. They pushed back again. Ethan adjusted the transit provision slightly, adding a small detail that Sarah had written in a second note halfway through the second round, a detail pulled from a trade addendum in the 2301 talks that the Marath house had quietly valued and never publicly acknowledged. On the 4th round, the lead Marath accepted. The room exhaled. Walking out afterward, Doru fell into step beside them in the wide corridor. He did not look at Sarah directly. He kept his gaze forward, his crest neutral, his voice measured. But he walked slowly enough that she could hear every word. "The Kessler Archive," he said, "and the 2301 addendum." He paused. "I have been on this council for 22 years. I did not remember the addendum." He said nothing else. He turned at the next corridor and walked away. Sarah watched him go. Ethan glanced at her, Her expression was still and quiet, but her crest was fully raised, and she was holding her datapads loosely now, the way someone holds something when they no longer need it as a shield. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about the question for a moment. "Like something I always knew was possible," she said, "that I had stopped believing anyone else could see." They walked the rest of the way in easy quiet, and the blue-green light of the Valoran afternoon came through the high windows and moved slowly across the floor ahead of them, steady and unhurried, the way things move when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Something had shifted in the embassy, and everyone felt it, even if no one said it plainly. By the morning of the third day, 2 junior envoys had quietly asked Carol Trent if Council Member Sarah was available for a consultation on Murath trade history. Carol had passed the requests along without comment, but with the particular expression she wore when she found something quietly satisfying. A trade minister from the Northern House had sent a short message inviting Sarah to a private briefing she had never been included in before. A researcher from the Second Archive had left a document outside Sarah's door overnight, with a handwritten note asking if she had seen a specific file from the early contact period. Ethan noticed all of it. He said nothing about it directly, but that evening, when he passed Sarah in the sitting area between their rooms, he put a cup of hot tea on the table in front of her without being asked, because he had noticed on the first night that she always made tea in the evening, but never sat down to drink it properly, always carried it back to her reading while it was still too hot. She looked at the cup, then at him. "It will still be warm in 10 minutes, he said, "if you want to finish what you are reading first." She looked at him for a moment with that careful, measuring expression. Then she sat down, left the datapad on the table, and picked up the cup. They sat across from each other for a while, without speaking. The window was open a small distance, and the night air came through, carrying the faint mineral smell of the Valoran dark, cooler and sharper than the day. "People are starting to notice you," Ethan said eventually. "They are starting to notice that I am useful," she said. There was no bitterness in it. It was simply an accurate distinction. "Is that different from what you wanted?" She thought about the question properly, the way she thought about most things. "I am not sure I ever let myself want anything specific," she said. "Wanting something specific requires believing it might happen." She held the cup in both hands, the way she held things she valued. "I became good at wanting the general version. I wanted the work to matter. I did not let myself want to be seen doing it." Ethan looked at her. "And now?" She met his eyes. "Now I am not sure how to hold both things at the same time," she said honestly. "The work mattering and being seen doing it. It feels different than I expected." "Different how?" She was quiet for a moment. "Larger," she said. "More exposed. When only the work mattered, there was nothing personal to lose. Now there is." She paused. "That is more frightening than I anticipated." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that. He had felt it before, in different forms, in different rooms. The specific kind of fear that only arrives when something starts to actually matter. "It does not go away entirely," he said, "but it changes. It becomes something you carry alongside the work, rather than instead of it." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you do?" "Most days," he said. She considered this, then looked back at her cup. On the 4th morning, Ethan went to find her before the day's first session, and discovered she was not in the sitting area or her room. He asked an attendant, who directed him with a slightly uncertain expression to the lower archive. The lower archive was 3 levels below the main embassy floor, reached by a staircase that got narrower with each flight. The air at the bottom was cooler and drier, and smelled of old materials and careful preservation. The lighting was lower here, not dim exactly, but softer, the kind of light that suited long, quiet work. Sarah was sitting on the floor between 2 tall shelves, back against one, legs crossed, datapad in her lap. The reading chair at the main desk nearby had a neatly stacked pile of documents on it, not abandoned. The floor was where she worked. She looked up when he came in, not startled, but aware. "You were not in the sitting area," he said. "I woke early. I wanted to check something before the session." She held up the datapad briefly. "There is a secondary reference in the Northern Trade Brief that connects to a binding clause from the original Valoran Marath framework. If they try to invoke the framework in today's session, we should have the clause ready." Ethan looked at the floor, then at the stacked chair, then back at her. He sat down on the floor beside her. She looked at him sideways. "You do not have to sit on the floor," she said. "I know," he said. She watched him for a moment, this human who had chosen her in a room full of better options, and was now sitting on the floor of the lower archive at the 7th bell, because it was where she was. Her expression was difficult to read, but her crest had risen quietly, and was staying there. She handed him the datapad. "The clause is on page 3. I have marked the relevant section." He read it. He asked 2 questions. She answered both thoroughly, pulling additional references from memory without checking anything, the way someone speaks about something they have lived with for a long time. They worked through it together for the better part of an hour, sitting on the floor in the quiet archive, while the morning light shifted slowly in the narrow high windows above the shelves. At one point she said, without looking up from her reading, "No one has ever come to find me here." He did not treat it as a big statement. He answered it simply, "I figured this was where you would be." She turned a page. "How did you know?" "Because it is where the real work is," he said. Then she turned another page, and the small movement of it was the only sound in the archive for a while. When they walked upstairs together for the morning session, Carol Trent met them at the top of the staircase, with the look of someone who had something to say and was choosing not to say it. She handed Ethan a briefing note, handed Sarah a separate one she had apparently prepared for her specifically, and turned to walk ahead of them down the corridor. "You have been doing her briefing separately," Ethan said. "Since the second day," Carol said, without turning around. It seemed efficient. Ethan glanced at Sarah. She was reading her briefing note with full attention, her crest steady and high. She did not look like someone who had spent years standing at the end of a line, waiting to be passed over. She looked like someone who had always belonged in the center of things, and was only now arriving there. He thought about the old trader in the early contact histories, the one who wrote down every name and used it correctly, the one who appeared in 17 diaries, not because he was powerful, but because he made people feel like they mattered. "Small things," Sarah had said. "Small things are what actually happen." He thought she was right. He thought she had always been right. He thought the only difference between then and now was that someone had finally stopped to listen. The corridor ahead was bright with the morning light, and they walked toward it together, side by side, without either of them needing to say what that meant. The alliance signing was set for the last evening of the negotiation period, when the Valoran sky turned the particular deep blue-green that the people here called the true dark. The hour before the stars came fully out, and the air tasted like cold metal and something faintly sweet underneath it. The great hall had been changed for the occasion. The long banners were still there, but new ones had been added, hanging between the old ones, carrying the seal of the combined alliance, in a thread that was half Valoran silver and half the warm gold that human envoys had apparently contributed to the design. 3 months ago, in the early planning stages. The floor had been treated with something that made it reflect the light like still water. The ceiling lights were split, one half the warm gold of human preference, one half the cool blue-green of Valoran tradition, and the 2 colors met somewhere in the middle of the room and became something that was neither and both at once. Ethan stood at the center of the hall with Sarah beside him. She was wearing the formal crest band of a diplomatic partner, a narrow piece of worked silver that sat just above the base of her crest and caught the mixed light from both sides of the room. She had not owned one before this week. Carol Trent had found it through the embassy stores, and it had taken some adjustment to fit correctly, and Sarah had stood still for the fitting with patient, careful attention, the same way she approached everything. She looked like she belonged at the center of the hall. She had always looked like she belonged at the center of things. The difference now was that she had stopped trying not to. The other council members were arranged around the room. General Doru stood with 3 of the veterans near the eastern wall. He had not said much to Ethan directly since the morning of the second day, but something in his bearing had changed. The stiffness was gone. He watched the proceedings with the expression of someone who was recalibrating something they had held as settled for a long time, and doing it honestly, without looking away from the correction. The signing itself was brief. The documents were large and formal, printed in both languages side by side, and each signatory added their mark in the specific way their tradition required. Ethan used a pen. The Valoran council members used a small seal pressed into a pad of deep blue. The lead Marath observer, present as a witness, used a stylus that left a mark in their own script along the bottom margin. When it was done, Carol Trent let out a breath that was quieter than it was meant to be, and the hall filled with the sound of Valoran approval, a low, resonant hum that moved through the room like something alive. After the formal portion, the hall shifted into the reception period, and people began to move and talk, and the carefully arranged formality of the evening relaxed into something warmer. Ethan stood and accepted the greetings of several delegates, said the correct things, shook the hands and clasped the appropriate limbs, and worked his way gradually toward the quieter edge of the room. Sarah stayed close without hovering. She spoke when spoken to, answered 3 questions from junior envoys with the thorough, exact quality that had become familiar to everyone in the embassy over the past several days, and twice quietly redirected conversations away from topics that would have created complications, so smoothly that neither party noticed the redirection. He noticed. He always noticed. It was near the end of the reception when Sarah's father approached them. The Valoran ruler was a tall figure, broad in the way of someone who had carried responsibility for a very long time, and his scales were the deep gold of his house, and his crest was full and steady. He moved through the room with the ease of someone for whom every room was already arranged. He stopped in front of them and looked at Ethan first. "Commander Cole," he said. His human standard was careful and precise, the human standard of someone who had learned it properly and used it rarely. "You chose my youngest daughter." "Yes," Ethan said. "She tells me you sit on the floor in the archive." "When that is where she is working, yes." The ruler was quiet for a moment. He looked at Sarah then, and the quality of his gaze changed. It was no longer the look of a ruler. It was the look of a father, and it carried in it the specific weight of a person who is seeing something they should have seen before, and is holding that awareness with honesty rather than deflection. Something passed between them that Ethan did not try to read. It was a private thing, built from years of history that he was not part of. But Sarah's crest rose during it, slowly and fully, and when she looked back at her father, her expression was open in a way it had not been at the start of the week. The ruler turned back to Ethan. "She has been going to that archive since she was small," he said. His voice was measured and even. "She would come home with documents older than our current government, and explain them to anyone who would listen. I listened when I could." He paused. "I did not listen enough." He paused again, longer this time, "and I never once went to find her there." Ethan held his gaze. "She is worth finding," he said. The ruler looked at him steadily. Then he inclined his head in the Valoran gesture of deep acknowledgement, crest lowering and rising again, full and deliberate. "Thank you, Commander," he said quietly, "for what you saw." He moved away into the reception, and they watched him go. Sarah stood very still for a moment. Then she let out a slow breath, and the tension that had been sitting in her shoulders since the start of the evening moved out of them and did not come back. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked. "Yes," she said, and then after a moment, "I think I am, actually." They made their way eventually to the balcony above the great hall. It was a wide stone platform, with a low railing that looked out over the embassy gardens, and beyond them to the open dark of the Valoran night. The stars were fully out now, moving in the long, slow arcs of this world, different from the arcs of Earth stars, but beautiful in their own clear way. The sounds of the reception came through the open doors behind them, warm and muffled. Out here, it was cool and quiet, and the air smelled the way the Valoran night always smelled, metal and sweetness and the faint sharp edge of distance. Sarah stood at the railing beside him. "The alliance is signed," she said. "Yes," he replied. "You go back to your assignment?" "In 3 days," he said. "There is a debrief first." She was quiet for a moment. "And then what happens with this?" She did not gesture or explain. She did not need to. Ethan looked out at the stars. "The alliance creates regular contact, official visits every 4 months, a standing communication channel, joint sessions twice a year." He paused. "And I am specifically listed as the human liaison for the first 3 years. Sarah turned her head to look at him. "That was decided 6 weeks ago," he said, "before I arrived. But I did ask, when I read it, whether the liaison role would allow me to request a specific Valoran counterpart." She was very still. "What did they say?" "They said the request was unusual but not prohibited, provided the counterpart consented." He looked at her. "I have not asked yet, because I wanted to ask you directly." Her pale gold eyes held the starlight. Her crest rose slowly, the full movement of it, unhurried and steady, until it was fully raised and staying there. "You are asking me," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The sounds from the reception drifted out around them, and the stars moved in their slow arcs overhead, and the silver plants in the garden below caught the last of the hall's light and held it softly. "I have studied the early contact era for 6 years," she said. "Do you know what I found more than anything else?" "Tell me," he said. "That the things which lasted were never the large events," she said. "They were the small ones, a name remembered, a floor sat on, someone going to find a person that no one else looked for." She paused. "The small things are what actually build something." "I believe that too," he said. She turned back to the stars for a moment. Then, carefully and with full intention, she placed her hand on the railing beside his. Close enough that the space between them was not much of a space at all. "Yes," she said quietly. "I consent to being your counterpart, Commander." Ethan looked at her hand beside his, and then at her face in the starlight, and he thought that of all the decisions he had made in his career, the one that had cost him the least and returned the most was the one he had made in a formal hall, at the end of a curved line, when everyone else was looking at the obvious answers, and he had looked all the way to the end and stopped. "Thank you," he said. Sarah smiled then, a full and real thing, and it changed her face completely, opening it up like a room where someone has finally turned on all the lights. "You say that a great deal," she said. "You deserve it a great deal," he said. The stars moved slowly overhead, and the night was cool and wide and full of distance, and neither of them moved for a long time, standing at the railing together, while the reception behind them filled the air with warmth, and the world below them went quietly and beautifully dark.